Welcome everyone to our Guilt-Free Book Club, this time featuring the Faculty Ambassadors of Inclusive Excellence. Thank you so much for joining us to continue our discussion of Learning That Matters, a field guide to course design for transformative education. We're going to focus on Chapter 8, Strategies That Matter, which dovetails so nicely with our discussion as a group of inclusive instructional and teaching practices. So my name is Josh Luckins, and it's a pleasure to be your host once again. I'm just going to reshare the collaborative notes document in the chat for folks who just entered the Zoom room. And I'm going to share that on my screen right now so that folks maybe watching at home can see what this looks like. So this is a document, and I'm sorry I'm scrolling so much right now. I have to move the Zoom thing so I can get more quickly to the top. So this is our discussion, and if you are watching at home and you want access to this document to see our collaborative thinking, just email teach@wit.edu. And there's a whole bunch of favorite quotes, mostly populated by me, but feel free if you're in this chat right now in the Zoom to add your favorite quotes from the chapter. Um, and then there's a section for key takeaways, um, and additionally other links in case people bring up other teaching resources or things, things they want to cite. Feel free to put that there. So this is going to be our guide today, and just to frame it. In this chapter, the author suggests that high quality teaching strategies, which dovetail perfectly with inclusive teaching strategies, because inclusive teaching practices are practices that are best practices according to the science of learning and support all students in succeeding, are active and engaging, focused on discovery, processing, or application, are intrinsically motivating, are sticky, based on research into what creates significant lasting learning, and are culturally affirming. And we'll talk more about what that means and what the authors mean by that. But I'm interested in what you all have to say and what you all think that that might mean and how that comes up in your practice. So let's go around, and I will, just invite anyone who's in this chat to unmute and share who you are, what you do at Wentworth, and either a key takeaway from the chapter and or something that you're doing in your classroom that you consider to be an inclusive instructional practice. So the floor is open.
I guess I'll break the ice then. My name is Susanna Gao. I'm the Associate Dean in the School of Sciences and Humanities and recognize a lot of my great faculty and colleagues. Um, I am also a professor of biology. And the couple approaches I use, I engage in case studies, which are a strategy for trying to get the science that I teach in the classroom into real life. And there's a wonderful resource that I have found through the National Science Teaching Association. Happy to share that with anybody interested in trying to use case studies. And then the other thing I do in my lectures, I'm conscious about including examples of underrepresented scientists or underrepresented communities. So in the biochemistry class, we teach about amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. And indigenous peoples knew that essential amino acids were not necessarily always found in different foods. And so they had consciously created what's called the Three Sisters as a diet. And those three, squash, beans, and corn, contain all of the essential amino acids for a human diet. And so I bring that up in my classroom to showcase what, to dovetail into the topic, but also to show a resource or a culturally affirming. I think that was the quote from the chapter, a culturally affirming approach to learning the topic in a way that I think helps people see there's not just one way to understand or resource for learning. So that those are the couple of strategies that I can point to, I think, that fit the whole concept that we're focusing on today.
Thank you so much, Susanna. Thank you for bringing in the notion of bringing in different ways of knowing, different cultural ways of knowing and expressing knowledge. I think that's really beautiful, especially in a science class that you wouldn't necessarily expect that, and it's so true. Also, speaking of bringing in voices, underrepresented voices, shameless plug for last year's faculty ambassador, Andrew Saradinsky, professor of physics, is doing a Wikipedia Women in STEM editathon on Wednesday. I know some of the folks in this Zoom are going to be there bringing their classes. So that's just another opportunity to raise up the voices of underrepresented folks, particularly in STEM at Wentworth. So feel free to join us. It's going to be basically 10 to 5, I think, in the CEIS lobby. So that's the story with that. Floor is open for anyone else to share.
Sure, I can go next. My name is Jeremy Walker. I'm a assistant professor of physics here. I would say one strategy that definitely jumped out to me there was I think it was broadly lecture support was the idea, but also this idea scattered throughout about having the students reflect upon what they're doing throughout the course. So one thing I have my intro students do is at the end of every single day of class, anytime before the end of the day, they can do it at the end of class itself or just once they've had some time to process, is a little exit card, which is just what's one thing today you found interesting and what's one thing today you still have questions about. And these are just entirely for completion. I don't have participation grades, so if students can't attend, say because they're sick or they're busy, they can still do these as long as they engage with the material. And I found it's a good way both for me to get a sense of where the students are at, but also for the students to just sort of check in with what they understand and what they're still curious about.
It's Jeremy. Yeah, I love that tactic of enhancing retention and transfer by using some sort of metacognitive wrapper, whether it's that exit ticket at the end of class or something at the end of a bigger assessment, like a project or a test that then students would reflect on, what they could have done better, what went wrong, and make those corrections. So they're actually learning from those errors because that's just how we learn as humans, and it's in a low stakes way, and it's not kind of this high pressure one time only, but there's lots of ways to show your learning and also to get that dialogue going between the faculty and the students and each other. So there's this co-creation of knowledge, and you can meet the students best where they're at when you know where they're at because they're regularly telling you. So thank you so much. Yeah, floor is open again.
Hi, I'm Tom Baccio. I'm the Associate Director in Academic Support and Success Studio. And I also frequently adjunct for math. And so I don't know, my takeaway in part was just like a general reaction. I thought this was a really nice chapter. And what I kind of liked is like, felt like it was very tightly written where they kind of set out these maybe like four principles at the beginning and then just like everything always was like very related to like, okay, like how he presented a ton of different strategies, but it always kind of related it back to those principles. And so I like that because I feel like, I don't know, when you're just kind of given like a list of strategies without this like overarching framework, it feels a bit more just like a grab bag. Just like I just thought it was like very like tightly written and it, you know, the four things feel like you could easily like, okay, when you draw up a lesson plan, you could just do a quick check mentally, like, okay, is it active? Is it intrinsically motivating? Is it that, and kind of do a self check. Okay, like which ones are, if like I'm not doing that, like are there, alterations I can make to some of these like classroom exercise to make it a bit more one of those. Yeah, I just really enjoyed reading it.
Thanks, Tom. Do you have any thoughts on, and also Lorenz, because I know you both work in the Success Studio, do you have any thoughts on how some of these practices could apply to a tutoring context in addition to a classroom teaching context?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely applies to tutoring. I mean, the nice thing about tutoring is it's like kind of inherently active, and like a lot of what we talk about in the tutor trainings is like how to get the students that's visiting like kind of engaged as possible. If and I think it's interesting to think about like intrinsically motivating since you're maybe not setting out the lesson as the tutor, like students coming to you with like something, and maybe you're like, well, I just need to do this because it's on my homework. But as a tutor, you can provide some context about like, well, why is this important? Like something I encourage tutors to, like if they've been on a co-op and they use something to like let the students know that, because it kind of shows like, all right, you're not just being made to do this, but it's like it's useful, it's important. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that you brought in the idea of transparency, which is woven through the whole book. But basically, like, it's one thing to have a great teaching strategy, but if students don't understand why they're doing it, it's not going to land as well as if you're really transparent about, like, hey, we're going to do this thing, and maybe it's different from things you've done in the past, or maybe it might be a little bit uncomfortable, and that's part of the goal. And in discomfort, there will be growth and learning. And so when you're able to be transparent about what you're doing, then students will get more on board and, kind of have that buy-in. I also really liked the way that the authors introduced the chapter with a lot of kind of theory and then moved into the practice. So it wasn't just like, here's 50 things you could try in the classroom. It was like, here's the underlying frameworks, and then here's things that align with those, and also how you might adapt it. And also, like, all these aren't going to work in all your courses. One of them might be perfect for a history course, and it would never work in physics, and vice versa. So I really like that too. All right, love to hear from somebody else who we haven't heard from yet.
Jennifer, do you want to go?
If that's okay, thanks, Faith. So Jennifer, I teach in the architecture program along with Ingrid. I see Ingrid on the call, and I couldn't help. I enjoyed reading the chapter. Thanks for having us, part of this year's cohort of the ambassador program. So I couldn't help but read the chapter with regard to our sort of studio pedagogy. So those of us who are in the kind of the design school, and I don't want to make it just about design students, because I think some of our strategies in studio, I think a number of us use in our seminar and lecture courses as well. We find them particularly effective with our students, and that's the active learning part. So the engaging and sorry, I'm forgetting the active engaging part of the chapter, right? So often we'll have students make sketches or, do a little model or something like that. And that is maybe just as effective or more effective as, writing notes, taking notes. And, so I think the studio environment in particular is intrinsically motivating because often we'll ask students to bring something to the story that the studio is telling. So there's sort of an engaging story that we build, maybe something about, what kind of building it is and, who it might serve. And then asking students to maybe contribute a piece of that. And how might you shade that with regard to a kind of personal interest? So there's a number of things in the studio environment that I couldn't help but apply to this, and at the same time then read the chapter to critique the studio environment. We often have very high pressure presentations at the end of the semester where a student has to stand up in front of their peers and present, and we use language of defend your project, and the guests we invite are jury. So there's very much this sense of judging, and I think that this project or this chapter really sort of opened up alternative, or reminded me of alternative ways of running these kinds of evaluations, where we might do something like what they call a gallery walk. So there isn't the sense of being on stage, or where they may critique each other first, before it's maybe put in front of guests, or, I guess to decenter the professor a little bit. And then finally, to Susanna's point, we are much more conscious now, thanks to some of the efforts of our leadership, to just remember who we're inviting to these reviews. Who is this, if we do have a formal presentation, who is on this panel? Does it reflect, the kind of the diversity of the student body as well, as well. So a whole bunch of thoughts that I thought were really inspired by the chapter. So thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, that was really inspiring, everything that you shared. I personally have been very inspired by the architecture and design studio model of education since we're learning a lot more about it, since being at Wentworth. And I think it really does inherently contain a lot of these best practices. And I agree that there are all these like little tweaks to make it even more inclusive. I remember we read a book, What Inclusive Instructors Do, a couple semesters ago by Tracy Addy, and I think it was in that book that there was a chapter about or an anecdote from somebody who had studied architecture and was like, all we ever learned about was, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and there was all these other peoples around the world building structures in their environments that we could also look at and be inspired by, and not only have a Western perspective. So that's just one, way to bring that stuff in, but also I love this notion of like, oh, in some way the expectation that everyone's going to be able to stand up and eloquently defend their piece is a sort of a hidden curriculum, and it's like, how much are we actually educating or training folks in that specific skill, rather than just expecting them to go off and do it, and also supporting students to succeed who are fabulous designers but maybe less comfortable, standing up and being that kind of like speaker in that way. So I think all great thoughts, and I'm glad that the chapter offered you some ideas for other ways to do it and to diversify the means of instruction that you're using in the classroom. So thank you.
So yeah, one other thing I've heard some of my old colleagues from Penn State University say is an exam is a celebration of knowledge, which is kind of a cool reframe.
And if you're able to create that culture in your class from the beginning, then, by the time the exam comes, maybe people are less stressed out about it because they've had enough practice, getting feedback, giving feedback, doing all these things, that they feel really prepared, as opposed to just like, this is the one time I get to show what I know. And if I didn't get enough sleep, then, too bad. So yeah. Faith, you were going to jump in, so pass the mic to you.
Thanks, Josh. Good morning, everyone. I'm Faith Lachak-Moralato, a faculty member in the School of Sciences and Humanities and part of this year's Faculty Ambassador cohort. Everything in the chapter really resonated with me, and I'd like to share a practice that I do in my classroom regarding writing. So each thematic unit that I do is scaffolded, and I start out the unit by creating something called success teams with the students. The success teams get changed up throughout the term, but basically, I will randomly assign students a writing group that they function with for the entire unit. And at the start, they come together and they do what's called a success team constitution, where they kind of come up with different norms and things that they want to achieve as a group in helping really the peer editing process. And sort of to close the loop at the end of each unit, I have one-on-one writing conferences with the students. I think the peer editing piece is phenomenal. But I also want to offer the students a little bit of my own time and attention to discuss different aspects of their writing with them. And that's one thing that students always comment on that they really appreciate, is having that time with me to go over things that maybe they didn't feel comfortable saying with their peers, or just to make sure that they're on the right track. And it really sort of aligns with this idea of being active and engaged, and making sure that they are part of the process, and that their voices are heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's fantastic. You really have a practice already in place that is using a lot of these strategies and provides students multiple avenues to get feedback and to build community and to hear from different voices and get different perspectives. And yeah, so I think that's a wonderful thing. And it's so interesting to come together with folks from different disciplines to get inspired by, obviously we can't exactly adapt that practice, copy and paste, but how could we include a little bit more of that in some of the studio feedback or in some of the engineering design projects we're doing, or whatever it might be. So thanks so much. And yeah, we have a few more folks who love to hear from as well. So feel free to unmute and just share your thoughts.
Okay, I guess I'll go. So yeah, I found I didn't get completely through the chapter. I'm traveling right now, but I think some of the stuff that stuck with me is, for the most part right now, so I'm Ingrid Strong, sorry, from Architecture Department, School of Architecture and Design, along with Jen. And I think one of the things that stuck with me from the chapter is this idea about how to make sort of lectures more participatory. I'm teaching the freshman class this semester, and we have what are called big idea talks, which are sort of introductory talks on various concepts or principles of architecture at the sort of foundations level. And we often ask students to, any questions, any comments, what do you guys think, right? But when you're in a room with 185 students, it's not particularly conducive to anybody sharing much of anything, right? Um, so some of the takeaways that I sort of got from the chapter had to do with, is there a way to sort of break them down into smaller groups to help them sort of ask each other questions, or come up with maybe some common ideas or common questions that they'd like to ask, and then have maybe one person represent a smaller group or something like that. Just sort of trying to think about ways of having them participate in the lecture on a certain level. So that's one piece. And then I was also thinking about it in regard to, I'm also teaching the flip side, which is our thesis students, and they're working on a book right now. So I'm doing the seminar that helps them with the book. And in that case, they spend a lot of time just sort of working on their books, and I go sort of and sit with them individually and talk to them. But there was one comment in the chapter that sort of caught my eye, which was this idea about my sort of stepping away and having them sit in a circle and sort of talk to each other. And I think that could actually be super useful in this situation, because it's too easy for them to sort of sit back and say, well, now what should I do? And it's their thesis, right? It's their big project. So it feels to me like they really need to take charge, and that they know each other's work well enough that they could actually help each other out quite a bit. So that got me thinking about, maybe thinking about ways that students can sort of lead the course or lead the class, taking turns sort of being the leaders in the class and having them really guide the conversation. So that was another thought. And then a third thing that I've been teaching students for a while is it was a brainstorming sort of exercise that was done back in the 60s, in a kind of workshop. I don't know exactly what the origins were, but I learned it when I was really young, teaching like sort of preschool kids, something called synectics, which has to do with giving 3 pluses and then a wish. And I've been teaching my freshman students this for a while, because they worry about critiquing each other's work. But that's really at the sort of the heart of the studio experiences, that students learn to help each other out. They learn to sort of work with each other. And so the 3 pluses and a wish is this idea about sort of 3 constructive positives that they see in someone's work, and then 1 wish, which is, how do you stretch this further? So the idea is sort of keeping it positive, but then giving sort of room for growth. And that helps students from feeling defensive or feeling like they're doing something wrong. So I've been working with students on that for on and off for several years now. And it seems to be useful, because they feel emboldened by that. They feel like, okay, you gave me a structure, I can work with that. So that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. Those were fantastic examples and takeaways. It actually dovetails with one of my quotes that I wrote down from the chapter, from page 157. The authors write that in discussions, structure is your friend. Deliberately structuring your discussions can help promote equity by providing a framework for all students to participate. And obviously, what those structures are gonna look really different if it's a massive lecture versus a small seminar versus, the kind of thing that you were talking about at the end, where students are providing feedback on a piece of work. And I have a couple thoughts on all of them. So the feedback structures, I really like some of the what they call thinking routines from Project Zero at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. So they have kind of some frameworks for how students can respond to creative work or give feedback. There's one that I used to use when I was devising original theater, called See, Feel, Wonder. And it was like, what do you see? Just more like, what actually did you see? Just the aesthetics of it, what happened, the composition, what occurred. To just like call out different things, because everyone, was going to pop out different things for them. Feel, what did it make you feel? What did it make you feel or think or evoke? And then the last is questions. What did it make you wonder? What do you want to know more about? What curiosity does it inspire? That was kind of a nice structure. And once we kind of introduced it, then I think we got richer discussions, richer feedback from students. And it was less of judgmental. It was a bit more inquiry based. It was a bit more conversational. And then there's also Liz Lerman's creative response, which is like a bigger, deeper process she's a dancer and a choreographer, and that process has been adapted to all sorts of different disciplines. It's really, really cool. Critical response, Liz Lerman's critical response. It's a bit more in depth, but it's pretty fascinating. In terms of the big lectures, I was thinking about some of the technology tools that folks use, whether it's like to have a back channel chat going, or even to have, more robust dialogue on a sort of a Padlet or a Miro board, or even polling software. You could use like a Quizlet or a Kahoot, that type of thing. So those are ways to get engagement in larger spaces where not everyone's going to necessarily be raising their hand, in addition to those small group discussions, which are of course fantastic. Yeah, and then in those seminar style ones, there's so many ways. I think the chapter covers some of them, but just to get a bit more structure in there and empower students to be the ones taking leadership once you've established those norms and that culture of support and how the discussions are going to go, and you can kind of step back and let them learn from each other a bit more without that kind of that thing that I remember I've experienced as a teacher, and the authors write about of that the students all talk to you. It's like stop telling me, don't just tell everybody. So how can you create that space? So this is great. So fantastic takeaways. Thank you so much. And it's just another example of how everyone read the same chapter and brings out different things, and that's the richness of our coming together, and the diverse voices that we have and perspectives we have. So yeah, Kapil and Lorenz, do either of you guys want to share your thoughts?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Lawrence Marcellus. I'm one of the advisors for the School of Computing and Data Science. I did forget to finish reading the full chapter, but my key takeaway that I saw was that the author talks about emotions being used when you teaching and learning, with students not emotion connected at the before people just thought there was the Patrick this learning was just very rational. There was no emotion involved. The reality is, if the student doesn't care about what you're talking about, there's no way to learn that. And I think even as an advisor, if I'm with a student that's taking a course and they don't feel the bigger picture behind it, is like, why am I learning this? And explain to them, well, if you don't master the basics, when you get to a high level, the professor obviously cannot know if you know the basics or not. So that's the reason why they create the curriculum for that. There's a reason why the curriculum is set up the way it is, and everything you do is built up to the next step. So having them understanding that, or if I meet with the students where they sort of behind and they don't really know how to obviously talk to the professor, like where I'm at. So obviously helping them ask questions. Okay, so if you go to office hours and talk to the professor, it's understanding, okay, where am I right now? And if you still stuck, then you can obviously use tutoring. So, and I always tell them you have to know where you are to know where you're going. So I think just reading about that, just different strategy. I can work with different students, depends where they are, having semesters to have them when they meet with the professors to have a dialogue, or if they go to tutoring, so what type of questions that they can ask. And also, even also for studies, what's the best way to study? So I think that, even though I don't teach, meeting with students and being that bridge, it definitely helps to guide them about that type of question they can ask the professors, or even with the tutoring. So it's been interesting being, in that realm where like I could sort of guide when the student goes tutoring, what questions they should ask, or I could help them guide if they meet with the professors. And it's like I don't know what to ask. I was like, well, ask see what do you know? So start with that. What don't you know? And then the professor obviously can guide you. And I was telling them like they're the expert of what they teach. I can tell you because I'm not in the classroom. So you have to go and talk to them. You can have that dialogue, but eventually you have to go there and have that conversation. And about what's the best way to prepare for it. So just reading about that and just understanding the emotion you have to care for what you're learning for now, even though you don't see the bigger picture. So I think that goes a long way.
Thank you so much, Lorenz. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought in that key importance of emotion to cognition. And the authors in this book are citing one of our colleagues from the Simmons College in the Colleges of the Fenway, Sarah Rose Kavanaugh, who wrote a really seminal book about the role of emotion in teaching and learning in higher ed. And so I'll just share really quickly that quote, which is that academia, it's from page 147. Academia has traditionally viewed learning and the pursuit of knowledge as a rational process devoid of emotion. This makes little sense as emotions are powerful and they can grab our attention, motivate, and contribute to deep learning. We've long known that to ignore emotions in learning interferes with meeting our aims. So, yeah, it's such a strange thing that in K-12, we focus a lot on social emotional learning, and then, 1 year later, a few months later, students come to higher ed and it's like, oh no, but that's done. Now it's just you got to just show up and do this. So it doesn't really make much sense. So, Wentworth being a teaching focused institution with mostly relatively small classes, we do have an opportunity to be aware of where our students are and meet them where they're at, and create supportive teaching and learning spaces that are taking into account where students are, and creating those positive emotional experiences that are going to promote deeper learning and deeper community building. So thank you so much. Kapil, would you like to share any of your thoughts?
Hi, my name is Kapil. I'm an assistant professor in the mechanical engineering department. This is my first time, so I haven't really read the book, and I was just looking at the link that Josh shared. So I'm looking at this March 18th, chapter 8, Strategies That Matter. And I somehow got to the bottom of that page where it says high quality teaching strategies include. And one of the things that I highly promote among my students, especially in the engineering classes, is to collaborate, to co-construct knowledge, and everything else that's listed down there. So one of the advantages that I have experienced, especially in the last week or so, I had this extra credit problem where individually students were not able to solve that particular problem. It was a relatively complicated problem, but I allowed them to work together. And as a result of that, not only were they able to solve the problem, but also understood the concept. So in the afterward, when I gave an exam and I asked a similar problem, and surprisingly, about 80% of the students, particularly the ones who have already solved that problem beforehand, were able to solve the problem to the right answer. So that made me quite happy. Other than that, I really haven't read the book, but I thoroughly enjoyed the thoughts and the ideas that all of my colleagues have shared here. So thank you for having me.
It's such a pleasure. I'm so glad you're here. And remember, this is called the Guilt-Free Book Club, so feel absolutely no guilt about not having read the full chapter. That's why I make the notes and all that. So yeah, just happy you're here and hope you're glad you're getting something out of it. And I'm so glad that you're able to see some of the practices that you're using in the classroom reflected in the chapter. And I'd like to welcome Lauren. Thanks so much for being here as well. And we've just kind of completed our go around, so I won't make you jump in right away, but at some point soon I will ask you to, if you feel like it, you're invited to share any takeaways you have and anything you're doing in your classroom that is you consider to be inclusive practice that maybe dovetails with something in the chapter, but take a minute to think about that. So Kapil, you were talking about so basically a peer instruction type technique where you're like, okay, there's this paradox of expertise where I know so much as an instructor that it's hard for me to identify the gaps and where students might be struggling to put all the pieces together in their kind of foundational knowledge. But when you get students working together in smaller groups, they are able to help fill in those gaps in learning for each other, with each other. And as they've had practice on those exact types of problems collaboratively, then they're going to be more successful on the exam rather than just a more traditional approach of like, I'm going to show you how to do it on the board and then, good luck on the homework, So that's a great approach. Kapil, do you want to add anything? So you're unmuted.
No, thank you.
Cool. So, before I invite Lauren to say something, if you want to, I just love this quote from the beginning of the chapter. That's a question from 141. They ask, I love that they ask questions throughout the chapter to like allow us to reflect. So, should they ask, how much of your own education was largely witness, record, memorize, regurgitate, forget? I see some folks nodding. And then they ask, to what extent do we as educators regularly ensure that students experience the joy of discovery rather than simply witnessing and recording what you as a professor have already discovered and made sense of yourself? Any thoughts on that? I see a lot of heads nodding. Anyone want to add anything to that, or how that resonates for you?
This is Ingrid again. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ingrid.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I was a Montessori kid, so I was very much out of that kind of record, memorize kind of cycle. I did terribly on tests because I couldn't. I just never learned how to take them really. I didn't have that skill. But I think that the question that you're asking about sort of what do we know, and in a sense, what are we kind of conveying, or how do we know that the students know on some level, is a really interesting one. I think for me, that's maybe one of the trickier questions, right? Like how do we confirm that people really understand what's going on, or that students understand what's going on, or that they're sort of getting the concepts and the principles. And I think on some level, part of what Lorenz was talking about resonated, because I felt like he and Tom become the kind of the front line of trying to sort of problem solve when students don't get what we're trying to teach, or what we think they get, but they don't, right? And so there's something really interesting about being sort of in this forum and thinking about like, okay, so here are two people who are sort of taking on the students that were not able to understand what we were trying to teach. And it may seem obvious to us, it may seem obvious to some other students, but not to all the students. And so then what, right? So I'm just fascinated by that kind of question and how to solve it, I guess, how to think through what it means, and how to work with that. So it's more a question on a question, I guess.
Thanks for jumping in, Ingrid, because as you were speaking, it actually helped me formulate my thought a little bit more. My initial reaction when you asked is if it resonated is that I think that's kind of why a lot of us are in this business, right? It's that incredible moment when a student goes, and they have that kind of realization or that joy of discovery. So that was the first reaction I wanted to share. But as I was able to reflect on it, I was thinking a little bit about, I think there was a quote in the chapter where it said, teaching is not telling, right? And learning is not reflecting, I think. And so I think as instructors, often what we do is we kind of try and set up the circumstances around which a student can then make those discoveries. And just a side note, I took a class in theatrical directing back in college, and it was all about, you don't tell someone you're furious with your husband, you have to, you can't stand his voice anymore. I remember I was in an exercise where my character was called to do this. We all had to take turns being the actors and the directors. And the professor actually said, I want your partner to bark at you like a dog. And so I was trying to do my scene while my partner was barking at me like a dog. And so in that moment, you can't help but react. And so I think teaching is kind of like that a little bit, where you're like, shut up, I'm trying to say something, right? And so I think with teaching as well, you have to set up a circumstance. So same thing, we have these things called in-class charrettes in studio, where we may not, we, as designers, we may have a sense of, where a design should go, but instead we create a circumstance where the student will discover it for themselves. So we might say, you know what, try turning your model upside down. Let's just see what happens. Or let's flip this drawing back to front. Or you know what? I just want you to make three models, but let's use paper instead of some other medium. And it's just this incredible thing. And then you say, okay, you have 45 minutes to do this. And as long as, they don't have that kind of anxiety around, timed exercises, it really can be very exciting because then they find it, they discover it, and they did it themselves. They made it, it was engaging, and of course, it was all their own effort. And so I think that's one way where you can encourage joy of discovery is by kind of setting up the circumstances and the limits within which students can work.
Absolutely, yeah. Creativity is often sparked in new directions by creative constraints, and I'm so glad you brought in theater directing, a passion of mine, and also that quote. I'll read you the quote. It is from page 141. So the authors are talking about the value of productive struggle. So they say, just as teaching is not telling and memorizing is not learning, you are not there to do the work for them. Find strategies where students have the joy of discovering new ideas, processing and making sense of their own learning, and applying what they've learned in ways that matter. And basically, that's how to break that cycle of regurgitate and forget. Because if students are, making it meaningful for themselves in their own ways, it's going to be meaningful and lasting and transferable and deep. Ultimately, as the title suggests, learning that matters, not just learning that is playing the game of school to get you a decent grade to then go on and do something else. But yeah, I personally, as a theater person, find the aesthetics of discovery to be wildly compelling, and that's like what we're going for in on the stage is not something that is dead and rehearsed and flat or pretended, but is just truth in the moment under imaginary circumstances. It's discovered and it's live, and as you said, that's when you see students making those discoveries, it's so beautiful and gives you the inspiration and energy to show up next year and do it all again. So thank you so much for bringing that in. And Lauren, I shared the collaborative notes in the chat, so hopefully you got that and are able to take a look. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, I was about to chime in sort of on the productive struggle and that realization and joy of discovery thing, because I'm realizing as we're having this conversation that aiming for that realization and that aha of I got it is great, and it's commonly what I'm looking for, but I'm realizing as I'm thinking about it that some of the classes that I've been working on recently struggle from it not always being clear to the students when they've achieved it, that they can work on a problem and get to an end and not know whether it's right or not know whether they've accomplished the thing or not, and that it becomes somebody sitting in my office going, oh yeah, it feels really good when I get the green of WebWork telling me I got it right, as opposed to I had a realization that made this make sense and this answer that I got makes sense. And so I think there are some disciplines, and I'm not saying that this is a math thing across the board, because we absolutely have places where you can see an answer and go, oh yeah, that makes a ton of sense. But there are some aspects of skills that we are trying to teach where that joy of discovery is harder to find, because the only affirmation that you have of, yeah, I got it that time and it made sense, is somebody coming around and saying, yeah, you did. Yeah, give me a high five because you got it finally. Or something like that, as opposed to, there's a factor of 2 there, but the concept made sense. And so that joy of discovery, I think, is a bit more challenging to find when they don't have a way of determining that the thing that they did is an achievement.
Yeah, for sure. And it makes me think of like some of my conversations with fabulous mathematicians like yourself who've explained to me that real mathematics is not, doing calculations, but it's actually this like incredible conceptual thing and seeing the world in new ways and, turning around ideas. And it's like, wow. And if I had known that when I was in school, maybe I would have looked at math differently. So just the question of how do we invite students into that joy of discovery and into that sense of these disciplines as deeply connected. In our last segment, I do want to chat about culturally affirming teaching. So I'm just going to share the screen and show you this little section that I've condensed from page 146 to 147 because I think that everyone would be like, oh yeah, sure, culturally affirming teaching, why not? But it's hard kind of to define, to know what it is. So I'm just going to share this. So they ask these questions, these core questions of what would it look like to incorporate methods and strategies that are consistently relevant to and effective for all students? And how can you turn classrooms into communities of practice where teachers and learners collaborate to create knowledge? So they identify these four elements of culturally affirming teaching practice: the co-construction of knowledge through collaboration and discussion, identifying, sharing, and incorporating students' strengths, lived experiences, and emotions, supporting students in navigating the hidden curriculum, and cultivating spaces where disagreement and tension are productive and coexist with trust and support. So take a second and just look at these and, see if anything jumps out to you as something you personally experienced as a student or something that you bring into the classroom as a teacher. I will share, and you guys have access to this document, so you can always find this by just searching for culturally affirming. I'm going to share a quick thought, and then I'll open up the floor to your thoughts about culturally affirming teaching. So, in my graduate program in education, I had a class that focused on multicultural education, and the professor kept on coming back to the incredible body of research that just shows how much creating a real sense of community and belonging and having students really build those relationships with each other and feel like a part of a learning community, a meaningful learning community, increases outcomes across the board for everyone, but disproportionately increases outcomes for students who are historically minoritized backgrounds, low income backgrounds, first generation backgrounds, all of those types of folks who are, statistically performing a little bit lower in these types of institutions of higher learning. And so there's all this research that's showing that creating those relationships, that community, the feeling of belonging is increasing these outcomes for everyone, but disproportionately for these types of students. And the question is, wow, that's incredible. Like, why? What's going on? Why is that a culturally affirming practice? And also, like, why aren't we doing more of that? Like, if we know that that's a really effective tool to promote learning across the board, why do we just sometimes come in and just, lecture and give an exam and not create that community? And I think there's this sense of like, oh, well, there's so much content to cover, and and that's true. But at the end of the chapter, they come to this conclusion. They're like, listen, would you rather cover 50 things and have the students remember 10? Or would you rather, do all these practices, which do take a little more time, but even if you only cover 35, the students are going to remember 20 of them, and then they'll be better prepared for the next class in the sequence. Not because you didn't cover it, but because it was more meaningful, it was more in depth, it was more lasting, and that's their whole title of the book is Learning That Matters. What thoughts do you all have as we're kind of wrapping up our discussion about what culturally affirming teaching might mean to you, what it might look like in your classes, and feel free to refer back to that quote as to what jumps out to you from those points that they cite as culturally affirming teaching practices.
So an example I think I can give, when I was doing my master's, I had a class with the professor. I did an assignment, and I was talking to her. I was like, "Listen, I think if you allow me to do a video and explain, like, it was an inflection paper, and I was like, I don't think if I write it, I'd be able to express as much what I'm doing." And the professor allowed me to sort of like do the video to do reflection, and I think like I always think about that experience. Like I felt like I did a better job at doing the reflection than if I were to write what I was gonna do, because I felt like I was gonna like spend time and thinking about if the writing is great and if I'm saying things the right way, then I think like it handles what I wanted to say. And so just thinking about talking about live experience, and the class was about higher education. And at the time I was working as a grad assistant. I was managing students, the RA. So just be able to explain that to with the reflection. So when I was reading the question with the course, and like if you're teaching, there's live experience, and I think like be able to talk about that, it was definitely helpful. So I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. I didn't even think that's what the professor was doing, but allow other ways to explain some things so students express themselves, not just you know just writing or just lecture, but just a video format. So I thought that was um it's interesting to see things that you did that was nice and see it in a book. So oh, that's what they were doing. So that was pretty cool. And this probably was one of my memorable assignments that I did. Honestly, I did the other ones. I read the papers. I couldn't tell you what I wrote. I don't remember what I wrote. But this, for some reason, was what I remember.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And, it dovetails so nicely with our Faculty Ambassadors program about universal design for learning and providing multiple means of instruction. But also just this idea of like, as a faculty member, it's so much more exciting when I'm actually learning alongside my students and from my students. And if they get to reflect, what this material means to them, how it connects to their lived experience, their body of knowledge, their way of knowing, then I get to see it in a new light too, and it keeps it constantly refreshed rather than having it just be that one-way street. It's a multi-way dialogue. So thanks for reinforcing those ideas. Any other thoughts about this culturally supportive teaching and what that looks like?
Hi there, I'd like to speak again. Thanks, Josh. So in my role as one of the ESL specialists and last term in my English 0800 class, which is the second ESL class students would take as they move through their English sequence. As I mentioned, I like to do a lot of thematic things. And so a big project that we endeavored in was a unit on sustainability, which culminated in the students creating presentations and posters on different areas of sustainabilities within their home country, which they presented at our department-wide showcase. This was really a wonderful activity to have them not only engage perhaps in a topic that they didn't know as much about, but also have them bring in that cultural piece and really do some investigation, from where they come from and how that sort of applies to different areas and things that we discussed here in the United States. And of course, being able to showcase that to other individuals and help them learn and grow, not only about, again, environmental issues in the US, but globally. So I think it was a really nice cultural exchange for the students and some really great learning.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Faith. I love that example. That's really rich, and I would love to have been there. It would have been, as Loren said, the type of learning experience that sticks with you and you remember, as opposed to just being an assignment that happens and a few years later you don't remember what it was about. So since Jeremy brought up metacognitive wrappers, like 1 minute exit ticket, whatever, however you want to frame it, at the bottom of the collaborative notes for this particular book club, there is a key takeaways section. So if you're so inclined, maybe take a minute to think about what your key takeaway is, and jot it down there so we can all have a little bit of a collaborative record, making our thinking visible and just, giving you a sec to reflect and come up with something that you're gonna take away from this discussion. If you want to do that in writing, feel free to just go ahead and do that now. And if you're somebody who is more, verbal processor, I invite you to unmute and share your final thoughts about this chapter and wrapping up our discussion together. So the floor is open to any way that you want to share a takeaway, whether it's verbal or in writing in our collaborative notes document. Really exciting. I can follow in real time the anonymous walruses and everyone typing in the Google Doc. So I always get a kick out of that. And as we wrap up, feel free to take some more time on this also, and write something at your own time. I'll look forward to it, and I'm sure other folks will look forward to seeing what everybody got out of this discussion. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to our faculty ambassadors for your ambassadorship. And if you like this discussion, we have another one coming up in a month with the co-author of the book, Julia Metzger, who is the director of Teaching and Learning Center in Washington State. And actually, she works at the Evergreen State College, which is a really unique institution that is putting into practice all sorts of teaching and learning practices that are not typically done in higher ed and are really, really cool and kind of cutting edge and progressive. So it'd be a really neat opportunity to meet her and talk with her. I'll send a follow-up email to everyone so you'll have the information about that. It's on our website as well. And then in the summer semester, I'm thinking of doing a pop-up topic on belonging with this book, Belonging: The Science of Creating Connection and Bridging Divides by Jeffrey Cohen, the chapter on education, belonging in education spaces. So that's another thing to keep an eye out for. Thanks again so much for being here. This was a great discussion. It was wonderful to see so many of our fabulous Wentworth faculty and staff here in the room today, and I hope you'll join me again and definitely reach out. I'd love to continue this conversation, and there's tons of ways that TLC can support you in bringing more of these practices into your classrooms. So feel free to reach out and have a great rest of your afternoon. Bye.
Thank you, Josh.
You're welcome.
Thanks all.